The Treaty of Versailles. The only good thing that came out of that treaty was an absolute banger of a song. In our timeline, the Treaty of Versailles was an extremely flawed treaty that led to Kanye West's idol rising to power, starting World War II and the eventual rise of the USA and the USSR as global superpowers. But what if things went differently? What if the Treaty of Versailles was done perfectly? For starters, let's just get all the minor obvious border changes out of the way that happened in the treaty that I agree with, and we'll move on from country to country, starting off with Austria-Hungary and Germany. So Austria-Hungary will be divided mostly the same as in our timeline, except for Austria and Czechia, which I'm about to get into. Although Hungary had claims over many regions, especially over the ethnically Hungarian lands, all of those were promised to all the other countries who came out of or carved up Austria-Hungary by the great powers and would thus be respected. As for Austria and Czechia, I will unite the two into a new Austrian state because although Czechia has ethnic differences from Germany, there was a section of it called the Sudetenland that was inhabited by ethnic Germans, so I would just unite the two together and we will ensure that the Czechians are ensured autonomy within the new Austrian state. From there, we will also split Germany in two, with the Catholic South joining Austria and the North becoming the Weimar Republic, which we will talk about later. By doing this, we can create a new balance of power that will ensure that there is not a central unified German state that will be powerful enough to remilitarize and attempt to conquer Europe like Kanye West's favorite political leader did. Over in the Ottomans, its Middle Eastern territories were carved up in our timeline, but in our timeline, those territories were actually promised to the Arabians in exchange for helping them out against the Ottomans, which the great powers did not respect in the treaty. In this timeline, however, we will respect that deal because 1. That would be the morally right thing to do, and 2. It won't lead to the rise of Arab nationalism against the great powers, which would cause problems for them. They could also strike up a deal with the Arabians potentially to have access to some of the resource-rich areas that they would gain, but will still have control over the land. Next up, we will ensure that the Treaty of Sevres is implemented, where Greece expands its land, and a Kurdish and Armenian state is created in the east, and then what's left of the Ottomans will just be this rump state over here. Moving on to the Russians, and as you probably know, they're in a civil war that resulted in the creation of the Soviet Union. In our timeline, the Americans, the British, and the French supported the rights during the Russian Revolution, which ended up being a waste of time because by the time they were able to fully intervene after World War I, it was too late because the Reds already captured most of the territory they needed to. What we instead need to do is have those powers accept the loss of Russia, but fight to preserve the countries that gained independence from Russia during the Civil War that didn't get the support they needed in our timeline. And the first step of doing that is through Poland, during the peace treaty. During the alternate peace treaty, Poland will gain all the territories from Germany that they did in our timeline. However, in this timeline, they will also gain all the Polish regions from southern East Prussia, as well as some of the more resource-rich areas of eastern Germany to make them more powerful. And with that, that will conclude the perfect Treaty of Versailles, border rise, or I guess all 5 treaties that ended World War I, if you want to get more specific. From here, the last things that we will need to talk about are more the political and economical side of things that would be even more important for the post-war world. For starters, we will not see as harsh of war reparations on Germany as they faced in our timeline that economically crippled the country while also leading to the rise of Kanye West's favorite political party. We will instead see a more reasonable system introduced, similar to the system that was used in Germany after World War II, where they pay their debts slowly over time through trade and help to rebuild the damage that they have done to other countries during the war. With Germany now split in two, Austria will also pay those debts to the Entente powers, which they defaulted on in our timeline, therefore allowing the Entente powers to actually receive all the war reparations that they were owed without crippling Germany, leading to the rise of Kanye West's favorite political leader, as well as prevented something similar to happening in Austria. Moving over to the new Armenian state, and we will have the Entente powers invested in Armenia's military enough so that they can get the go-ahead to invade the Caucasus with Iran. After invading it, they will split it, and Armenia will get, well, Armenia, as well as Georgia, while Iran will get Azerbaijan, who has a large ethnic Azerbaijani group within their country, which will prevent the Soviets from expanding into the Caucasus. Over in Poland, and with them being set up with more economic territories from Germany, combined with not having to worry about being dominated by Poland, with the help of France, Britain, and America, they could invest in Poland's military to make them into a great power over time, as well as the other newly independent Eastern European countries, which will result in Britain, France, and America making a lot of money over time from selling weapons to them, while also sending military advisors to train their militaries. While doing this, Poland could also team up with all the countries that are claimed by the Soviets or have land claimed by the Soviets, along with Slovakia, who would want independence guarantees from Hungary, to form the Intermarine Project, with backing from France, Britain, and the Americans to contain the spread of communism to just Russia. This alliance will not result in Poland dominating all the other countries in the Intermarium, like what some Intermarine plans suggest, but it will act as an economic and military alliance purely aimed at preventing the Soviets from gaining control over them to ensure their independence. Focusing back onto the Russian Civil War, and they most likely would have tried to conquer their Eastern European territories like they did in our timeline, while they are forming the Intermarine Alliance. However, they will be deterred by the British, French, Polish, and to some extent, American troops, and will instead focus on conquering the rest of their core Russian territories instead. With the Soviets no longer spreading their revolution to the eastern territories, combined with the European powers not supporting the whites, in order to support all of the newly independent Eastern European countries, I would say that the Russian Revolution will end a couple years earlier in 1921. By the time the revolution would be over, they would be surrounded in Europe by the Intermarine Alliance and would be forced into isolationism from Europe and would focus internally on industrialization, purging, and stabilizing the country. The last political development change post-war that we will need to talk about is China. China, by the end of World War I, started its warlord era, and because of its weakened state, Japan attempted to take it all over in World War II, and then the Soviets supported the communists during the beginning of the Cold War in order to make it fully communist, leading to it becoming the country that we all know and hate today. In this alternate treaty, what we need is a reunified China that would be able to rival Japan and the Soviets so that we can create a balance of power in Asia, where the Soviets, the Japanese, and China are all played against each other to prevent each other from teaming up and expanding. The first step towards achieving a unified China is, ironically enough, to partition it. The reason for this is because the Soviets and the Japanese both have ambitions in China that they realized in our timeline, weakening China even more. What the great powers will have to do is accept this realization and crunch the Japanese and the Soviets' Chinese ambitions to an extent to allow a new centralized Chinese country to take shape, without having to worry about the Japanese and the Soviets contesting them. So for the partition deal, we will give Japan Manchuria like they got in our timeline, so that if the Soviets tried to spread communism into Europe or Asia, the Allies could invade the Soviets in the Far East, giving them a two-front war. The Soviets would receive Outer Mongolia up to the Great Wall of China, so that way the unified Chinese government would have a natural defense against the Japanese and the Soviets, as well as the Xinjiang region, which they took over in our timeline during the 30s like Japan did with Manchuria, and most likely would have done earlier in this timeline since they would be isolated from Europe. In this timeline, they would be united because of border war. Last of all, Britain and France would get protectorates for their colonies, with Britain gaining Tibet to protect the British Raj, and France getting these southern Chinese territories to protect their Indochina colony. So with that, concludes all the post-war treaties, and we can now focus on the post-war world. In Asia, the partition of China wouldn't happen immediately because all of these countries would be recovering from World War I and would be focusing on themselves instead of expanding. But just know that throughout the 20s, China would be partitioned, while the Soviets would be focused internally along with puppeting Xinjiang, and Japan would be focusing on conquering and integrating Manchuria. The great powers would be focused on propping up a centralized Chinese government, while they also take their claims by supporting Sun Yat-sen by recognizing him as the rightful ruler of China, while sending military advisors to train up their military, like what they would be doing in Poland during this time, while the Americans would give out loans to Sun Yat-sen to provide them the real military backing that they need. They would then expand across what's left of China throughout the 20s, until they eventually unify what's left. Throughout the 20s, the Germans and the Austrians will be able to slowly repay their debts over time to the British and the French, which they will repay to the Americans, who would then reinvest that money into funding the Intermarrying Project as well as Sun Yat-sen in China. While they will eventually pay the Americans back after they reclaim all their core lands, during the 30s, the Great Depression would still happen to an extent, but it would be way less worse, because Germany and Austria would slowly and stably repay their debt over time, and wouldn't have already been suffering from hyperinflation in the 20s like Germany did in our timeline. So France and Britain would have an economic backbone to an extent to help out in China. They would start to industrialize after stabilizing their country, and with pressure from China and America, the British and the French agreed to sell their buffer states, which they would no longer need because China would be stable, and they would rather have a good relationship with them in order to prevent Japan and the Soviets from gaining influence over them. And most importantly of all, China would also be in debt to America, France, and Britain, and would be paying them more and more through trade over time as they rapidly industrialize, which would help out with their economic issues during the Depression. Radical communist and fascist ideologies would also be way weaker in this timeline, and Italy most likely won't fall to fascism, and with Germany and Austria being in a way better economic situation than they were in our timeline, would also not fall to fascism. Without a fascist Germany and a powerful Soviet bloc and less radicalism, the Spanish Civil War wouldn't happen and they would remain a constitutional monarchy. Portugal would most likely not go completely fascist as well, but would instead move to a more moderate authoritarian side, similar to Eastern Europe in this timeline, because fascist ideologies wouldn't be as prevalent in Portugal as well. By the 40s, World War II would be prevented, and the economy would have recovered from the Great Depression, which would be much less depressing in this timeline. Because World War II is prevented, France and Britain would be the most dominant powers of the world still, with America and the Soviet Union remaining isolationist. To preserve their empires, it's very likely that France and Britain would move to a more imperial federation model of governing their colonies over time, which France attempted to do in our timeline. But because of World War I and World War II, along with the Great Depression, it weakened the European countries beyond repair and led to the rise of nationalist movements. And America and the Soviets pushed for decolonization as well, which resulted in the collapse of their empires over time. In this timeline, Britain and France would be able to create imperial federations, which in short is uniting the core British and French territories to the rest of the colonies, creating a system similar to the USA, where each of their colonies would become provinces within a larger union and would have a lot of control over their own governing, but would have to submit to a central government that would handle foreign policy and the military. I'm planning on making a video that will go really in depth in this scenario eventually, along with all of these other videos, so don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, as the vast majority of my viewers are not subscribed to the channel. It would really help grow my channel so that I could become more relevant within the alternate history community, because this is the most underrated channel within the community. Anyways, moving back to the scenario, over the course of the 20th century, more and more of Britain and France's colonies would be integrated within their respective federations, and all the other colonial powers would also most likely follow this new way of governing, eventually including Japan after they settled their territories. The USA would hold on to the Philippines later because they wouldn't lose it after World War II, but eventually they most likely wouldn't want to control it anymore. From there, they could grant them independence, or they could sell to China to prevent the Japanese from gaining influence over it, which could affect trade between the Americans and the Chinese, which I believe is the most likely option to happen. As for the Soviets, there would be no invasion of Afghanistan because they would be part of the intermediate to prevent themselves from being invaded by the Soviets, and then eventually over time, the communist system that the Soviets would have would most likely shift over time to something more similar to China's model that they have developed, which would be authoritarian but capitalistic, and only really communist by name. With that, there's not really more to talk about. The world would have become much more stable sooner, and we would lose a banner of a song. I don't really know how to end this video, because everything I would usually say, I already said a couple minutes ago. So...